The practice of translation, as all of you know, has been central to our idea of literature for as long as humanity can remember. One of the earliest works of literature we have knowledge of, if not the earliest, the Epic of Gilgamesh, comes to us via a heroic series of translations, beginning with the so-called Standard Version, which is an edited translation from Sumerian to Akkadian, believed to have been made by a Babylonian scribe named Sinliki-Ununi, sometime between 1300 and 1000 BCE. It would be hard to come up with a definition of literature that was not premised on the centrality of translation. Whatever else it may be, literature is, we all seem to agree, that part of the great human conversation that survives beyond its local context, be that context national, linguistic, or temporal. This remains true whether you're a postmodernist theoretician who believes that literature is entirely produced by those local contexts, or whether you hold with John Milton that a good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life. Were we to travel back in time and give our founding translator, Sinliki-Ununi, an account of the present status of the calling he inaugurated, our brilliant, enthusiastic, and generous Babylonian scribe, as we must imagine him, for he would need to be generous indeed to forgive us for the terrible havoc our country has lately wreaked on the remains of his own culture and those that came before and after it in his region. Our scribe might easily conclude that the past 3 decades or so were a great golden age for the practice of translation in the United States. Almost every intellectual trend of the period seemed to indicate that our priestly knowledge wielders held the practice of translation in very high esteem indeed. Let's begin our account 32 years ago with the publication of a translation from the French, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's translation of De la Grammatologie by Jacques Derrida. That text, along with several others brought into English from French primarily, but also from German and other languages around the same time, proposed, among other things, that texts cannot be construed merely as a function of their author's intentions, that language resists and contradicts the uses to which we try to put it, and that readers construct texts that are in good measure of their own making. Writing cannot be thought of outside the horizon of intersubjective violence, is one of the ways of grammatology phrases this. This new theory of meaning was highly controversial in its time, though for those of us familiar with Borges' 1939 short fiction, Pierre Menard, autor del Quixote, which makes much the same point via the story of something quite like a translation, deconstruction did not come as a great novelty. Nor, to anyone who has seriously practiced literary translation, does it seem particularly controversial to hold, as deconstructionists do and did, that the meaning of a literary text is in large measure indeterminate, that even a single word or phrase can have 2 or more readings that contradict each other entirely. This is the stuff of a practicing translator's everyday life. Deconstruction provided a perfect context in which to understand the deep complexity of the act of translation, the fact that a translator does not and cannot simply replace one meaning with another precisely equal to it, but must construct networks of signification whose internal contradictions are as complex as those of the source text. On a more basic level, deconstruction demonstrated the great and transformative impact that the translation of a number of key works in philosophy and literary criticism into English could have. Wouldn't this quite naturally have made scholars extremely receptive to and respectful of the practice of translation? Within the same time frame, another significant trend was also reshaping the U.S. university. Multiculturalism called for an opening of borders, canons, and university admissions policies. Many of the texts most controversially associated with it, I, Rigoberta Menchú, for one example, which came to us via Elizabeth Burgos de Bray and Anne Wright, were translations from other languages. In its appeal to students and professors to go beyond ethnocentric or Eurocentric ways of seeing and open themselves to cultural difference, multiculturalism must have been virtually synonymous with the practice of translation, mustn't it have? It must have opened the floodgates to a huge number of texts from many different languages, and it must also have greatly heightened our general appreciation of the skills associated with the work of translation, which confronts us with the real and specific difficulties of negotiating among different cultural and linguistic contexts. Next, to make this period an even more gratifying time to be a practicing translator within the U.S. university, the widespread emphasis on theory that deconstruction had brought about during the 1970s and 1980s gave way during the 1990s to what was termed the new historicism. Literature was now subject not to theoretical exegesis, but to historical analysis. The literary work was to be studied in relation to its historical context, with particular attention to cultural difference. No one is in a better position than a new historicist to appreciate what Roy Harris, the founder of integrationist linguistics, has called the translator's creative recontextualization, the extreme attention that the practice of translation demands, both to the historical circumstances of the source text creation, which are crucial to an understanding of it, and to those of its reception in its new language, so that the translation can occur, as Jorge Luis Borges puts it in the Translators of the 1001 Nights, después de una literatura, in the wake of a literature. And one of my most gratifying moments in the last couple of weeks was seeing a lecture by Roy Harris at Princeton, Roy being an Oxford Don of a certain age, and the translator of Saussure's Cours de Linguistique Générale. And at the end of his talk, someone in the audience who was completely bewildered said, so you're saying that a translation is a kind of critique or commentary, that I could read your translation of Saussure and Saussure, and I could read both of them? And Roy drew himself up to his full height and said, oh, whatever do you think a translation is, man? Of course it's a critique. which really made me wish that I were an Oxford Don, because all he had to do was just say it, you know? It's great. And finally, to set the seal on this entire intellectual process and place the practice of translation once and for all at the very epicenter of literary scholarship, a whole new field called translation studies emerged during the 1980s and 1990s, magnificently inaugurated by George Steiner's masterful 1975 volume After Babel. This field explores issues in translation from the theoretical, political, philosophical, literary, and linguistic standpoints, and establishes once and for all the crucial role of the translator and the key imperative of educating and promoting highly skilled translators. Indeed, a number of noted translation studies scholars, such as Lawrence Benuti and Gayatri Spivak herself, are themselves practicing translators. Given the extraordinary emphasis that these prevailing scholarly trends have placed on matters involving complexities of meaning, the importance of context, cultural multiplicity, and the study of translation itself, it would be difficult indeed to explain to Sin Like Ununi, our poor Babylonian inaugural translator, what all of you have already understood very well as you've listened to this account. Why and how, even as these trends reshaped the university, the practice of translation was stigmatized and discouraged, and a view of translation as something other than and inferior to literary scholarship took hold.